Duino people. What are they like? And who are, or were in times gone by, the people of Duino? Of the village or the castle? Of the stone houses up on the karst? Or down towards the sea, which claws and gnaws the high cliffs? The people of Duino, Devin, that perhaps links the origin of the name to Magdeburg, the fortress of the girl and the legend of the White Lady, locked in the stone for centuries, a character almost confused with the Lepa Vida, the ancient myth from Slovene popular culture, to which the poetry of France Treširen gives new form. Or perhaps the people of Duino, Devin, so close to the mythical places of the Timavo and San Giovanni in Tuba, where the last trumpet at the end of time, here, Mirum Sparagens Sonum, will call the souls. Or, more and more prosaically, the people of Duino, or Tubino from Tuba, channel or conduit or natural siphon where the Timavo River flows, when it emerges from the darkness of the earth.
The Duino people. When did the story of this land, so harsh and unique, begin? Here, where the soft Mediterranean aromatic herbs coexist with the coarse, thorny vegetation that covers the rocks and the karst? Let's turn the clock back to 70 million years ago. A completely different landscape. A low hinterland close to the coastline and the sea. A coral reef environment, dunes and the white limestone beaches, lagoons with small inland seas varying in depth, a rich vegetation on the emerging land, and nearby, scree and limestone pavements. Freshwater springs would flow from small caves, providing water for the animals. Traces of these springs are to be found today in the rocks, in the form of stalagmites and pisolites. They are no longer flat at sea level, but have risen almost vertically, driven by tectonic thrusts that generated the cliffs and the karst. Not far from Villaggio del Pescatore, an abandoned quarry a few meters from the sea. Here in the 90s, an exceptional discovery was made, the remains of Antonio. Walking among these rocks is like travelling in a time machine. 70 million years ago, there was no karst here. There were no hills. This vegetation did not exist. But there was a shallow tropical sea in which rudists lived. They were bivalve mollusks, which died out along with the dinosaurs. They were builders of coral reefs. These instead are lamanites. They are limestone and constitute the muddy bottom of an ancient coastal lake of 70 million years ago. The dinosaur site was discovered in the 80s. The most famous dinosaur, but not the only one, is Antonio, a Tethys hadrus insularis, which means dinosaur, Hadrosauroidea, from the island, Insularis, of the Tethys Ocean. Today, Antonio, the original find, is exhibited at the Trieste Museum of Natural History. It is one of the best preserved in the world, the largest herbivorous dinosaur found in Italy, and has unique anatomical characteristics. For this reason, it is considered to be a new genus for science. For example, it has a tail that ends in a whip. Its foreleg has 3 toes. Its rear limb, instead, is long and muscular. The muzzle is unusual too. It is elongated and similar to that of a horse. Antonio was about 4 meters long, 1 meter 30 tall. And all these characteristics suggest that this was an animal that lived on an island. Because large vertebrates living on islands often acquired particular anatomical features and were herbivores. This dinosaur was a herbivore. It had a beak in front to tear off the plants and then grind them with its back teeth. Along with Antonio, in the same site of Villaggio del Pescatore, other fossils were found, some very important, like the Echinodon Adriaticus crocodile, also a new genus for science. This was a crocodile with a short, broad snout and molariform teeth used to grind crustaceans and turtles. Shrimps, fish, and also a bone of a pterosaur, a flying reptile, were also found, along with plant remains.
Trail number 47. A walk that connects Orezina to Slivia. Sliva in Slovenian means plum tree. An ancient karst village that appears in history in 1319 with the name of Salinja. The road reveals a landscape of rocks and caves. Maybe they are only traces that remain in dolines, cavities which are today in the open, or sinkholes, or, like the Pokala cave, a shelter for prehistoric communities, or, still, like this one, the cave of the towers of Slivia. Over 550 meters long, named like this by explorers at the end of the 19th century because of the stalagmites in the shape of towers that enliven its underground landscapes. One of the first caves of the Trieste karst to be explored and now open for tourist exploration. So, in 1885, it was described in the documents and memoirs of the Società degli Alpinisti Triestini. Thin and vague stalactites hang from the ceiling, veritable upturned cones, countless stalagmites, almost perfectly white spires, rise from the ground and try to meet them. Some have a large base and are several meters high. Others, slender and low, serve to better set off the grandeur of the former that seem to be thousands of centuries old, while these turn out to belong to more recent times. The more you progress, the more you are surprised. Here, bold colonnades seem to be the remains of ancient temples. There, stubby stalagmites lean on one another and seem to be trunks of a forest.
We're still in Slivia. Southeast of the village, a small hill and the impressive remains of the ruins of a castelliera, one of many fortified villages of the proto-historic era, which the karst still preserves. But who built it, and when? And how did the people who occupied it live? We don't know exactly who built this castelliere. Of course, thanks to archaeological excavations that were made in the 50s and then in the 70s, it is understood that it was inhabited for a long period of time, ranging from the middle of the second millennium, and that is from about 1500 BC, through the Middle Bronze Age and the entire period covering the Iron Age up to the 4th century BC. This means that on the basis of the excavations, which however were not exhaustive and were not carried out on the whole surface of the castelliere, life apparently ceased here in the 4th century, and thus this castelliere perhaps was no longer inhabited when there was direct contact between the Romans and the history in this area. This happened in the 2nd century BC, when the Roman armies encamped at Lacus Timavi, and therefore in an area very close to the mouth of the Timavo River. Titus Livius tells us about this adventure of war, which at the beginning results in the victory of the history over the Romans, and tells us that the locals watched the construction of the camp from the hills behind the river.
Fortified villages, ancient structures that know well how to take advantage of the geography of an area that goes from Istria to the karst plateau, to the plains of Friuli and even beyond. Sites chosen to dominate and control the surrounding territories. Villages within sight of one another. Castellazzo di Doberdo, a military checkpoint in Roman times of the territory and the roads to Istria and Dalmatia. The castelliere of Vertace, Golas, Focate, Moskenitsa, Brestovica, Flondar, Mount Ermada. Names and positions that span the years and become part of the strategies of defense and conquest of the Great War.
From the small village of Mediazza, ancient paths start and on leaving the town square rise and pass by the great Doline del Principe.
Deep and geologically ancient, strangely located on the side of a mountain, Mount Ermada, interrupting and almost barring the karst plateau. Many theories have been put forward to explain its genesis. Perhaps it's the evolution of a collapsed cave, or perhaps before, here, there was a sinkhole. The link with the area of the springs of the Timavo River is also mysterious. Was it the progressive widening of the underground caves, eroded and worn by the Timavo, which made the ceilings of the karst caves that then, being unstable, collapsed? Or maybe right here was one of the rivers that 8,000 years ago flowed on the surface, swallowed underground, as happens now to the Timavo River in San Canciano, Perhaps instead the external morphology was different and many waters flowed together in a single point that absorbed them deep down, creating a giant funnel by dissolution. What was its story? The Dolina del Principe is perhaps the most important evidence of the complex geological evolution of the karst.
Just below the summit of Mount Ermada, on the path that passes through the abandoned village of Casa Cohisce, a farm owned by the lords of Duino. During the Great War, the structure of some buildings, turned into military installations, was strengthened with walls of reinforced concrete, without altering their external appearance. In the course of time and all around, nature has regained its spaces, enfolding and hiding the signs of the past. But much still remains among the scree and in the karst caves that were used during the war and equipped as shelters or places to rest or receive first aid. Ermada, the cursed mountain for both armies. For the imperial army, which, after abandoning the high lands around Monfalcone, since 1915 from here controlled the entire territory. And for the Italian forces who, instead, were to conquer it.
Fritz Weber, a writer from Vienna, and an artillery officer, writes about it in his book Stages of Defeat. I open the sealed order. We have to take a position at elevation 323. There is only one elevation that can be taken into consideration around here. An elevation that has a sweet and at the same time terrifying name. Ermada. We take care not to talk about it. The untamable beast, he will still call it. A maze with no return for the Italian troops, who, during the offensive, attempt to attack it and are captured by the ingenious and complex system of trenches designed by the Austro-Hungarians, and today which are partly still visible. Fragments which, along with the imposing remains of the observers of the armoured Nad Kokem, Mount Koko, with their system of underground connections, are a memory of the dramatic and heavy fighting. There's a place where the archaeology of the Great War is tied to the threads of history, fading into myth and into fragments to be reassembled for a landscape that time has profoundly changed. The area of the Timavo River, that emerges from its underground course in San Giovanni di Duino becomes a space in which, after Italy entered the conflict, 1915, and until the breakthrough of the Austro-German army at Caporetto in 1917, the forces involved faced stressful trench warfare. High on the karst edge, the Herm of the Third Army, which was built on a fort of the Austro-Hungarian defensive line, is still there. It's not far from the monument dedicated to the Lupi di Toscana, the 77th Infantry Regiment, the Tuscany Brigade, inscribed with verses from Virgil's Aeneid, which tells us about what has gone forever.
Unde per ora novem vasto cum murmure montis.
The river descends roaring, high from the mountain top, with its 9 mouths. A few meters away, there is a memorial stone to Giovanni Randaccio, who died on May the 28th, 1917, in the attempt to cross one of the branches of the Timavo. In the funeral oration, Gabriele D'Annunzio spoke of his lost friend as the one who vitam dedit Timavo, gave his life to the Timavo, recalling an epigraph by Caio Tuditano, the Roman consul who ended the wars against the tribes of the Histri in 129 BC, which he had seen at the Archaeological Museum of Aquileia, and Statue dedit Timavo, dedicating a statue to the river god, interweaving strands of history. Because here, at the extreme northern border of the Adriatic, the Caput Adriae of ancient texts, was the Lacus Timavi, a large body of water, where the sea met the land and where the Timavo, with its 9 mouths, re-emerged, a landscape the beauty of which can only be imagined now. And around the Lacus, sacred sites, lavish Roman villas, a mansio, a sort of hotel in ancient times, came to light in the park of the Aqueduct of Randaccio. Hot baths and furnaces near the river Lokovats, where a stone bridge was built under the command of Julius Caesar by the 13th Roman Legion, which in imperial times would be called Gemina, a name that later was to be given also to the road.
Lacus Timavi and its surrounding areas were part of an ancient network of prehistoric paths and roads made by the Romans, in an environment where it was certainly not easy to build trails for wanderers, wagons, and goods. They wore furrows in the stone, very similar to those that in the 4th century AD, Claudius described in his Carmi Mino for an area of ancient Veneto.
Large furrows worn in the rock cut the stone like long wounds. It is traditionally called the Path of the Plough of Hercules. Or was it chance that did the work of the plough?
Still the Ermada, on its slopes overlooking the sea. A natural cave hides one of the most important archaeological discoveries that this area has given back up. The excavations provided proof of the fact that the cave had been inhabited since a Neolithic age, and probably up to the Iron Age, and held later, in Imperial Roman times, a temple dedicated to Mithras, the Persian god of light and rebirth, born from stone, that in a cave killed a bull and fertilized the land with its blood. This is the only Mithrim in a natural cave discovered in Italy. It was used for ceremonies of a mystery cult that arrived here in the second half of the 1st century AD. It was reserved for men only and found particular favor, especially among the military. It was near this cave that the Roman garrison was stationed, probably in the place where now the Castle of Duino stands.
Long counters were placed in front of each other and were used for the ritual banquet of bread and wine. The darkness was broken by oil lamps. At the bottom of the cavity, the sacred image of the relief with the killing of the bull donated by a follower, whose name remained on a stele, Aulo Tullio Paumniano. The cult ended abruptly in the middle of the 5th century AD, when the sacred vessels of the cave were violated, destroyed and perhaps partially hidden by the followers of Mithras. In the same period, at a crossroads in time, which is no coincidence, one of the first buildings of Christian worship was erected, in the place where now San Giovanni in Tuba is located.
1100 years after Christ's incarnation, while celebrating the feast of Luke the Evangelist, the magnificent Abbot John saw, in a dream, a man who ordered him to take the saints still buried in the ground and give them a more worthy burial. And so, the bones of the Baptist of Christ, of the other John, of Stephen and Blaise, and the Venerable George and Lawrence are now in a new grave.
An inscription celebrates, together, Volderico, Aquileia, Patriarch of the 12th century, and the miraculous discovery of the holy remains, October 18th, 1113, the Feast of St. Luke. These relics had been hidden to protect them from, perhaps, the fury of barbarian invasions for 500 years or more. Archaeological investigations have brought to light what probably was the early Christian chapel of the 5th century in which they were kept. A sacred building on what had always been holy ground was enlarged in various stages and became a basilica and then a church with 3 apses, which houses the grave of the venerated remains. A tomb, tumba, that according to some researchers gave the name to the church dedicated to Giovanni Battista, John the Baptist, the saint related to the holy water, in continuity with the pagan gods who had inhabited the sources of the Timavo in the past. And the testimonies of these ancient cults abound.
In 1924, during restoration work at the Castle of Duino, a small altar bearing a simple inscription came to light, Timavo voto, to the Timavo for granting a request. And yet another inscription comes from the castle. It is dedicated to Spes Augusta, the same deity cited in an inscription on the wall outside the church, where a woman, Giulia, gives thanks for the healing of her husband and son, who had come here from Tarvisio. Also, Alconio Optato, a magistrate, arrived here from Aguntum, today Lienz in East Tyrol. Here, to the same place where also Caius Varro Saconio, a military tribune, arrived from Dalmatia to be healed.
Near the church, the few remains of an important monastery, a probable refuge for other monks fleeing from Aquileia in the 6th century, from Bellinia perhaps, who came here to find protection and refuge from the Lombards, near the coast, which was firmly in the hands of the Byzantines. These religious people, who were later to be engaged in the evangelization of the Slavic peoples afterwards, as evidenced by the Codex Aquilensis, which is now in Cividale, but seems to have come just from the monastery near the Timavo, and preserves numerous signatures of Slav pilgrims, which can be dated back to a time between the 8th and 10th century. The ancient and medieval shrines, the amber and trades, and the breeding of oves molles, the prized sheep with the wavy long fleece, and immune, it was said, to diseases, because of the beneficial effect of salt. Land and sea.
Laneus euganei lupus excipit ora timavi e quoreo dulces cum sale pastus aquas.
The woolly bass lives at the mouth of the Timavo Euganeo and feeds on fresh and salt water. Woolly, says Pliny in the 9th book of his Natural History, referring to its white and soft meat, qualities that come from life in mixed water, fresh and salt, near the mouths of rivers. Sea bass, which in French or German is still loup de mer, sea wolf, is not so different from what is still one of the elements of a cuisine that marries the sea to the land.
The land is poor, and of course the cuisine is poor too. Undoubtedly peasant food made of natural ingredients. A cuisine that followed the seasons. So spring is filled with the scent of pinza, traditional Easter cake, gelatina, a sort of meat aspic, lamb, roasted pork shoulder, horseradish. Summer offers an abundance of early fruit and vegetables. Autumn brings the last produce of the land and freshly slaughtered pork. In winter, instead, soups will be served up, especially jota, made with sauerkraut and beans. In the old times, meals were frugal and simple on working days and differed significantly from those served on feast days, when they were much more elaborate, rich and refined. Among these, there is a dish we have prepared today, the sciupetta, chicken stew with blecchi, homemade pasta. This was a dish that could not be missed out in the family festivities such as weddings, baptisms, confirmations and so on. The cakes that accompanied these dishes at these celebrations were strukli, made of small sweet yeast doughs stuffed with walnuts, wrapped in a cloth and boiled in water. Down, under the cliffs, down to the sea, and on the path of the fishermen. Also stonemasons. An ancient path, the same that probably was used for carrying the stone, cut out there in the quarries of Aurusina, taken down to the sea and loaded onto the cargo ships, and then carried to Aquileia, or Rome, or Spain, or Ravenna, where the great mausoleum of Theodoric, king of the Goths, was to be made, entirely of Aurusina stone, in 520.
Ancient paths. In the 17th century, Ireneo della Croce wrote, "Not far from the quarries you can still see the vestiges of two roads, commonly called piombino, because they were all covered with sheets of lead over 2 spans thick, which were used to transport columns and other stone that had been raised out of these quarries from the top of the mountain down to the seashore to load them on the ships." News somehow echoed, also in documents of 1830, reminds us that peasants found fragments of lead plates while digging vineyards in the area of Canovella dei Zoppoli. It is well known, and it was recorded by our journalists. Another historian from Trieste, Pietro Candler, writes that from the top of the hills to the sea, there were roads covered with lead to make the worked stones slide. They showed us the grooves, and they told us about the lead they had found, so that we neither doubt this nor know what to think. Then there was a long period of inactivity for the quarries, and then a new exploitation in the mid-19th century, when the stone was shipped to the large cities of Central Europe and beyond. Thanks to the growth of the quarries and the opening of the station on the Southern Railway, the village of Auresina, Nabregina, developed too. The open pit today, which uses a dazzling white limestone, 99.8% pure, and is one of the largest in Europe. It is an impressive chasm, 110 meters deep, that still has on the walls the signs left by ancient Picts.
Not far from here, there are also the remains of a house built in the 1st century BC and linked to mining activity. During an excavation survey, archaeologists found limestone blocks, roughly hewn column drums, and remains related to ironworking.
Not far from here, you can see the piezometric Tower of Randaccio. A little further on is the Liburnian Tower, built between 1854 and 1856, and designed by the Viennese architect Carl Juncker, who also went on to plan Miramare Castle. The construction of the tower, which is 18 meters high, was decided during the works for the Southern Railway. Connected to a branch of the aqueduct, starting from the springs of Auresina, it served the new station and the steam locomotives that would stop there. The two towers are the most spectacular observation points on the edge of the karst.
People of Duino, the or Auresina, Nabregina, going down to the sea to fish with zoppoli or chupa, boats made from a single tree trunk, spruce or pine, dug out with a hatchet. On the hull, 7 meters long and 70 centimeters wide, a large crosspiece for the rowlocks was mounted. It supported two 6-meter-long oars. The origins of the zoppolo date back to ancient times, perhaps to the earliest prehistoric times. This area is mentioned for the first time in 1621, when the Count of Duino confiscated a zoppolo from the fishermen of Santa Croce for having fished illegally in his waters. From 1500 and until after the Second World War, the zoppolo was also used for tuna fishing, almost a rite involving men, women, and even children. There was such an abundance of tuna that they could be fished just 20 meters from the shore. Once pulled ashore, the boats were kept on large stone steps called fasalli. Today, only 3 zoppoli still exist.
Were also the people of the Castellum Pucinum mentioned by Pliny people of Duino? Pucino, as the name of the wine to which this Roman naturalist attached special healing powers, which were much appreciated by Livia, the wife of Emperor Augustus. Giulia Augusta, he wrote, lived to 82 thanks to only drinking Pucino wine. Considering the strategic location of Duino, naturally protected and dominating the network of ancient roads, now we think that the mysterious Castellum Pucinum may have been built in the years after the incursions by the Iapodes in 52 BC and maintained its defensive functions up to late antiquity, so as to be part of the system of fortifications of the eastern border. Around, the terraced vineyards, for a wine that Pliny writes, was born in the bosom of the Adriatic Sea, near the mouth of the Timavo. On a rocky hill, it soaks up the breath of the sea and fills only few amphorae.
Moja duša je židene volje, kot bila bi pila kraški teran.
My soul rejoices, writes the Slovenian poet Oton Zupancic, as if having drunk the Teran wine of the karst.
Brindisi, brindisi.
People of Duino, Devin, who live in the village and beyond. Those whose origin and name have been forgotten by history, and who in late antiquity replaced the Roman garrisons and also lived here, close to what Paul the Deacon, historian of the Lombard peoples, called Castrum Potium, the place where the Duke Pemone imprisoned Callisto, once patriarch of Aquileia, who had moved seat and court to Cividale. Perhaps this is what archaeologists call the Palace of Attila the Hun, never investigated thoroughly with its remains that today are hidden by the vegetation. The name Attila's Palace has nothing to do with historical facts. It's a name that popular imagination has attributed to these ruins, which, until 1800, was still much more impressive and stood high up overlooking the sea. This site competes with Duino for identification as Castellum Pucinum, that is, a place of which Pliny speaks, recounting that it was close to the mouth of the Timavo, not far from Tergeste. The name Castellum would seem to indicate that it had, if anything, a military origin. The excavations made in the 1980s in an area near this place highlighted just such a collection of remains that is typical of the military posts of the 1st century BC. Around 50 BC, Tergeste was sacked, and as a result of this, all this area, close to the high mountain passes across the Julian Alps, was militarized. Moreover, the structure of the Palace of Attila presented a special technique that is typical of military settlements, and in particular the substructure system, of which here we can see now only a few remains. On the sheer cliffs, 2 long walls were built, parallel to each other, designed to support all the upstream area. Here we have just the beginning. So people lived there behind us, while here, these 2 major substructures ensured the stability of the whole system. From here you have complete control of the entrance to the port of the Timavo, which was a strategic point. With the Pax Augusta, the military role slowly diminished, and the site was surely in some way involved in the production of the Pucino wine.
People of Duino, Devin, that became the property of the landowners who owned the land and the castle. Von Tybine, lords of the 13th century, quarrelsome neighbours to Trieste, and Patriarchate of Aquileia, or Ugone, the last landlord of the lineage of Duino that in the 14th century offered this area to the House of Austria and became the first captain of a Trieste that had become a hereditary domain of those who would then be the Habsburgs. Tweener people, present at the arrival of the Walsee, and then at the end of the 16th century of the Hofer, with Mattia, a historical enemy of Trieste, a family whose history is interwoven with that of the Lombard family of the Torre Valsassina, and the Turm und Taxis, to whom Charles V awarded the contract for the postal services in the 16th century. A monopoly then renewed by hereditary appointment of the males of the family as general superintendents of the Holy Roman Empire postal services. Above, overlooking the sea, there is all that remains of a building, an impregnable stronghold which seems to have sprung from the rock. The Old Castle of Duino. The few remaining documents and some test excavations have not enabled us to detect fully the structure of the ruin, nor to date it back with certainty. The many ancient fragments found in the walls could be proof of how the castle was built on more ancient remains, probably Roman, or using landfills removed or found in artifacts, disused, or in ruins that certainly were in the area of the ancient Lacus Timavi. Nobles and castles. Next to them often in the Europe of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, the Catholic Habsburgs enlarged, restored churches and founded monasteries, such as, in Duino, the monastery of the Serviti Brotherhood, for the education of the children of the aristocrats. Here, in the early years of the 17th century, the first Italian-Slovenian, Italiano e Sclavo, dictionary, written by the monk Gregorio Alazia from Somaripa, was the first example of Slovene literary production of the caste, and that, until the 18th century, represented the only evidence of the presence of a Slovene population in these places.
It is a very important witness to the coexistence and effective bilingualism in this area at the beginning of the 17th century, of the Italian-Slavic bilingualism, in particular Italian-Slovenian of the Duino area, but also of a larger area. Then, it is also proof of the awareness of its author, this friar from Piedmont, of the importance of having the lexicographical and linguistic tools which might help the locals. And then, it is also a testimonial of the long lexicographical tradition, as much Italian as Slovenian.
The conversation manual that Alazia puts in the dictionary with absolutely realistic sentences is strikingly modern, intended to serve those travellers who are going to need the most diverse directions. A gentleman or beautiful young lady, is this the way to Duino?
O lepa deklica, je ta dober pot za it v Duin?
Give us the best wine
Dajte
that you
nam
have,
busega
and
vina
also
imate
that
in
Prosecco
vse
Ribolla
tistega
wine, which is
ribulla,
so
prosekača, tolikaj dobriga.
This dictionary includes about 2,600 entries, a very large number, which are related to the different semantic areas. Not only religion, indeed religion here occupies a rather narrow part, but also daily life. There are, for example, the lexemes concerning the cuisine, the house, the parts of the body, the animal world, the world of plants, etc. And therefore a very rich word store. So we could say that this is a work of small dimensions from the physical point of view, It is a very small pocketbook, but of the greatest importance for our area, and also for the Italian and Slovenian linguistic history.
The early years of the 18th century were more and more difficult. Bad harvests, an outbreak of animal plague, together with a ban on trade with the Republic of Venice. People, serfs, oppressed by a still resisting medieval age on the verge of survival, facing increasing demands for tributes and tax rises. The revolt from Tolmin spread along the valley down to the south and culminated in the Karst with the siege of the Duino castle. The order to repel the rebels was given, and the guns began their work. The crowd, helpless, dispersed. The people counted their dead, a dozen, and many were injured. The revolt of Duino ended like this. The Tolmin revolt had an even more tragic outcome. The leaders were caught and their bodies were dismembered on the Gorizia public square. Duino people were used to looking at the sea from up here. From the top of these cliffs that plunge vertically into the sea and that the rain has moulded like bizarre landscapes of stone. The path along the cliffs, the Rilke path, named after the poet who was a guest at the castle for a long time, is a strange and unique opportunity to see how the hot breath of the sea and the northeast winds, crossing the karst rocks, have created a unique natural environment which is now protected. Here you see, when I get here in front of these walls that rise so sheer from the sea, to this cliff with the sea down below, I think, how can they say that these stones cannot speak? They do speak. They tell us their story. Here is the story of our times. There are the signs of the flowing water, coming down the cliff, but to tell the truth, I see the cycle closing, 70 million years in a few seconds. Limestone that once was there, then was processed by the sea, formed the sand, sedimented layer over layer. The sediments locked in the fossils, and then again, important thrusts started to move these sediments and carried them, straddled them, turned them into rock, bending, squeezing, pushing them up. And here, this cliff, straightened, of limestone that today is being eroded by the sea again, very slowly. Again, it becomes sediment, and perhaps, in another 70 million years, these sediments will tell geologists something about us, through the fossils that will be found here in these sediments. It's a fascinating thing to think. Past, present, future. The rocks speak. From a letter from Rilke to Hedwig Fischer, 1911. It may not be by chance that the Duino elegies came to life in a castle perched on a bluff which, much like human existence, looks out of a few windows, my own included, over an immeasurably open stretch of sea, onto everything.
Ecco, si tratta di una zona veramente eccezionale perché
Here, it is a truly exceptional area because, at a glance, we can have an idea of what the Gulf of Trieste is, with the city to the east and the mouth of the Isonzo to the west. Also, here there are various elements of extreme importance from the geological point of view. For example, the vertical walls above the sea, the pinnacles, which are quite unique along the northern Adriatic coast. Then, the vegetation that is partly typical Mediterranean, and, of course, a number of faunal elements of extreme importance, especially from the biogeographical point of view. There are both typical Mediterranean species. I could mention the blue rock thrush, for example, a small bird, similar to the blackbird. The males are of a slate blue, that here is pretty much at its extreme northern limit of distribution. To help you understand the biogeographical importance of this area, I would perhaps speak of the most characteristic species of the so-called Algiroides, which is a lizard typical of the Balkans that is located in Italy, only here in the karst, and that is especially common in this area, which, by the way, is the symbol that was chosen as the symbol of the nature reserve. It is the establishment of the nature reserve which was made by the Friuli Venezia Giulia region in 1996 to permit, to some extent, the greater protection of bird life species which had been relatively rare. The Peregrine Falcon, which nowadays nests with almost absolute regularity on these rocks overlooking the sea. It is a raptor that had become locally extinct and that returned and resettled in these areas. It can be considered today as one of the most characteristic examples of wildlife in this area, which represents wild nature on the one hand, and also this environment, where we see a beautiful castle on the other hand, because in the past, landlords and falcons had almost the same kind of life, you might say. Now, the Belle Epoque society is dancing on the brink of the abyss. Chère maman, the aristocrat Hohenlohe children write in their letters to Teresa, Lady of Duino, and, on a visit to the castle, also Isabel Arundel, wife of an extraordinary character, the multilingual explorer, translator and writer Richard Francis Burton, British consul in Trieste, arrives. In a book which has never been translated into Italian, she recounts her memories.
Duino is a village picturesquely situated on an eminence overhanging the sea. The village is dominated by the feudal castle and fortress of the Hohenlohes, which stand on the rocks. Once surrounded by a keep, a moat and a drawbridge, in which now grow flowers. The village and everything around them is theirs, and their flag flies from the tower. The inn is a short walk from the castle, which is full of antiques, family heirlooms, Chinese porcelain, and also its ghost, the Dama Bianca, the White Lady. The grounds and shrubberies descend to the sea, where there is a bathhouse, where we used to have great fun swimming, fishing crabs, boating, and telling ghost stories. We had charming walks to hunt for castellieri. We walked to Slivno, drove to Attila's palace and got some curios from the ruins. And on June the 24th, we went to the horse fair of the Hungarian gypsies, which afforded some amusement. The drawbacks are the 40 minutes needed to reach a train. The princesses have sensibly, for their own peace, refused to have a station, in favour of a quiet life. The Trieste Sunday trippers cannot get so far, so it is beautifully still and countrified.